As we come to the 13th chapter of the Apocalypse again, and to consider from verse 11 the beast which comes up out of the earth. At the last class we concluded our consideration of the beast of the sea and the exhortation which is contained in the latter few verses from verse 7 onwards to us in our day and generation. And so we're going to start by looking at the beast which came up out of the earth from verse 11. And by doing so, I would like you to go back in thought to chapter 11, because all what we are seeing in chapter 13 is the development of what we saw in outline in chapter 11. Chapter 11 provided a skeleton upon which chapter 13 has put the meat and is putting the meat as far as the Roman Catholic Church is concerned. You will recall from chapter 11 that in verse 1 there was given unto John a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. And this which was given in just one brief outline by John here in chapter 11 is enlarged for us in chapter 13, because the power of the papacy, which began at the time of Constantine, as we have seen in chapter 12, developed in chapter 13 until it reached that great power which we shall see in the beast of the earth, which enabled it to exercise that authority and dominion against the holy city for this period of 42 months. And therefore we have made reference back to chapter 11, both in the phraseology which is used concerning the time periods and also for the action which the Catholic Church took, not only against the two witnesses but against the ecclesia of Christ. And so what we are finding in this beast of the earth in chapter 13 is purely a development of the beast of the sea in the opening verses. And this is easily ascertained by looking at the verses. We read from verse 11, we're in chapter 13 now, verse 11. I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. He had 2 horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of the men. And he deceiveth them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell upon the earth, that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword, and did live. Now the phraseology which we have there, reference to that first beast, whose deadly wound was healed, takes us back to verse 3 of this 13th chapter, when we saw that one of his heads, as it were, wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And as we saw under the symbology of that beast, the 7 heads were representative of the 7 forms of government under which Rome was ruled. The 6th head was the imperial head, and that was the head which was in control of Rome when it was overthrown by the horn powers as represented in the beast of Daniel and also in the Apocalypse. And the 7th head, which took over from the imperial power of Rome, was the Gothic head. And it was the Gothic head which caused the downfall of the western part of the Roman Empire in AD 476. Then we have seen through the development of the beast of the sea in chapter 13 that although the barbarian tribes were to have their part to play in the downfall of the Western Roman Empire, Rome itself as a church appealed to the east. And there in Constantinople was the military power of Rome, but now moved over to the east as had been taken by Constantine, and therefore it was the Eastern Roman Empire which supported the church to overthrow the barbarian tribes in order to re-establish its authority in the West. And that's what we have seen in the beast of the sea in those first 10 verses of chapter 13. And therefore, as we've said last time, although it wasn't the imperial Rome itself which had been restored, in essence the seventh head had been overthrown in order to re-establish the power of the church in the West. You'll notice in the verses that we have just read, reference is made again at the end of verse 12, for example, the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. And again, at the end of verse 14, which had the wound by a sword and did live. This was the Roman church which had been given its authority again by the eastern power of the Roman Empire in order for it to continue and to prosper. And we saw under various emperors from the east how they supported and elevated the Roman church. And verse 11, although it's describing another beast, the very phraseology which used shows it's purely an extension of the same power that we have beheld previously. Now, because of holidays, we weren't able to get our artists to give us a pictorial picture of the beast of the earth, but I've just brought the book Apocalypse and Gospels, which I'm sure most of you have seen and have got. And that's the way the writer pictures the beast of the sea in the opening 10 verses of this chapter. Whereas the beast coming up out of the earth is pictured like that. Now it's pretty obvious to see the difference. The one had the 7 heads and 10 horns. This one in verse 11 had 2 horns like a lamb. And therefore the writer of this book pictures the beast coming up out of the earth in the form of a lamb with 2 horns. But you'll notice that he spake as a dragon. Now whether and actually that was what John saw, he doesn't say that the beast was in the form of a lamb. He just says he saw another beast coming up out of the earth and it had 2 horns like a lamb. What the rest of the body was, obviously, he doesn't tell us. But that's a fair, I suppose, assessment of what it was. The point we've got to appreciate is that he spake as a dragon and exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them that dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. So the principle involved of this beast of the earth was exactly the same as the beast coming up out of the sea. It was to enable the Catholic Church to prosper and for all the world to worship this great monstrosity. Now if you remember, as we look in verse 4 of chapter 13, the Revelator there says, they worshipped the dragon, which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him. And we identified at that time the dragon representing the military power of the east, which gave its support unto the religious power in the west to enable that to prosper and speak great words of blasphemy in verse 5 against the Most High. And you'll notice a similar situation now in verse 12. He was to exercise power in order to cause all the earth to worship the beast again. And therefore these 2 beasts of Revelation chapter 13 are linked by the very context of the chapter together. They are distinguished, A, in appearance, and B, by the very nature of what the words of the verses say. But they have got this common link that people will worship the beast. Now, the reason they are generally referred to as the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth is for the obvious reasons of verse 1 and verse 11. John saw in verse 1 the beast coming up out of the sea, whereas in verse 11 he sees the beast coming up out of the earth. So that's why the first one is generally referred to as the beast of the sea, the second one as the beast of the earth. Now, what we want to do is to just take you forward a wee bit in history from the time of the beast of the sea, which will take us back in thought to chapter 8 and chapter 9 of the Apocalypse. Now, chapter 8 and chapter 9 saw in the trumpets the overthrow of the Western and then the overthrow of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire in chapter 8 we have seen during the period of the first beast of the sea in chapter 13. The Gothic head replaced the imperial head, and then eventually after Rome in AD 476 had fallen, the church looked to the east, which had continued, for its support and its prosperity. Chapter 9 of the Apocalypse tells us that because of the Saracens, you remember friend Mohammed, and also the Ottoman power, that the Eastern power also was to decline and fall towards the middle of the 15th century. So whereas in the early times it was able to support the church in the West, as the Saracens began to make inroads into the Eastern Roman Empire, it began to lose some of its power so that it was not able to support the church in the West. And what chapter 13 from verse 11 is going to tell us is the other power which comes upon the scene to support the papacy when the power of the East, the Eastern Roman Empire, was in the decline. So in verse 11 of chapter 13, I beheld another beast come up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And history records how the graphic fulfillment of these verses actually was to take place. Rome found itself attacked again by the barbarian tribes, this time by the Lombards. And the Lombards were one of the horns which we have seen as we have gone through the description of Daniel and the Apocalypse, one of the barbarian tribes which were to make the inroads into the Roman Empire. And it was the Lombards who attacked the land of Italy and Rome in particular, and subdued the power of the papacy once again. Rome inevitably, I'm talking about the church, looked to the east for support. It looked to the Eastern Roman Empire to protect it as it had done before, as we saw in the Beast of the Sea. It wanted them to be able to send again their military might to support it and to overthrow these barbarian tribes. Unfortunately, because of their own problems with the Saracen power, the Eastern Roman Empire was not able to support the papacy. There was also another problem. The Roman Catholic Church, which of course was not confined to the West, it was throughout the East and Western parts, had come in conflict, the one part with the other. The Catholic Church in the East, although controlled by the Bishop of Rome following the edicts of Justinian, found itself at variance with the Church in Rome over the worship of idols. The power in the East did not feel that it was right for the Christian Church to have idols. The power in the West, the Church of Rome, felt it was quite in order and proper for idols to be part of their worship. And therefore there was this great religious conflict between the church in the East and the church in the West over the worship of idols. This was linked to the decline of the Eastern power because of the inroads of the Saracens and subsequently by the Ottomans. And therefore when Rome, because of the invasion of the Lombards, appealed to the East for support, it didn't receive it. The East did not respond to the overtures of Rome. And therefore the Catholic Church in the West was faced with one of two situations. Either that it was going to be completely submerged under the rule of the Lombards, or it was going to look elsewhere for support. And therefore it looked towards Europe. And it saw in Europe a power that was gaining in ascendancy. And it was the power of the Franks under the rulership of one called Pepin. And Franks, of course, is France as we know it today, began to grow in power and authority. And because it was, in quotes, Christian in outlook, the papacy found an ally in Pepin and the rising power of the Franks. Pepin was later succeeded by his son, Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was a great supporter of the papacy. And in a series of battles, all of which are outlined in history, Charlemagne and the Franks triumphed over the Lombards and the barbarians and released Italy and Rome from their domination. Now, Charlemagne had got probably three motives in the battles which he fought against the barbarian tribes. One, of course, was his own personal ambition, because obviously, like most powers, he wanted to be the greatest power in the earth at that time. Many had tried before him, from Nebuchadnezzar through to Cyrus and all the great leaders of men in the past. Many have tried in our day, as we know, with Mussolini and with Hitler and people like them. And so Charlemagne was no exception to personal motivation in causing him to try and be the greatest leader of men in the earth at that time. Secondly, which obviously is allied to it, the domination of other lands in order for the Franco power to grow and extend its dominion. But thirdly, and this is where the papacy received the benefit, he also wished to support the papacy and extend throughout the powers which he could dominate Christianity. And therefore, as in the East, the Eastern Roman Empire were finding through the inroads of the Saracens that the Saracens were trying to make them submit to that one God rather than the Trinity of gods which they worshipped, being part of the Catholic system. So we find that in the West, the rising power of Pepin and then followed by Charlemagne and the Franks, as they grew in stature and extended their influence over many lands, they wanted to extend the influence of Christianity. And one of the conditions which they imposed when they conquered any nation or power was that that power had to submit to Christianity. And therefore the Pope found a great ally in Charlemagne, to the point that on Christmas Day, AD 799, it was the Pope himself who crowned Charlemagne. And the interesting thing about it, as far as we're concerned, is he crowned Charlemagne as Caesar Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. Now that was in AD 799, and the actual title which the Pope conferred upon this man Charlemagne was Caesar Augustus, Emperor of the Romans. Now, when you think, it was in AD 476 that Rome had fallen. It had lost its power. The barbarian tribes had won them over. The Gothic power was now in charge. Subsequently, as we saw with the beast of the sea, through the help of the Eastern power, Rome again was given some freedom. But it never had an emperor or a ruler in the West. If you remember from last time, we saw that what the East did was simply put a garrison. It just put a ruler for the time being, a governor as it were, in the West. And we linked it, if you remember, in thought to like the Falkland Islands. And we gave the principle that the governor in the Falkland Islands is obviously doing it on behalf of the British government. But the seat of power hasn't moved from Westminster down to the Falklands, although it was Britain who was victorious in the war. We have simply got a garrison down there and a governor in charge. And so the Eastern power from Constantinople, although it relieved the papacy of the barbarians, it didn't move its power back to Rome. It simply put a garrison there and left a governor in charge. As the power of the East declined because of the Saracens, obviously they had to bring some of their garrisons back, which enabled the barbarian tribes, the Lombards in particular, to gain the ascendancy again, hence the cry from the papacy for help. Charlemagne was now crowned as emperor of the Romans. The power in the East was still there. Although it was having a battering, the power in the East was going to exist for many a long century, until the 15th century. And yet the Pope had the audacity, without the power obviously, but he had the audacity to crown Charlemagne as emperor of the Romans. And the Eastern power was powerless to do anything about it. Now this began what has become known in history as the Holy Roman Empire. And as we have commented before, with that well-known phrase, it was neither holy, Roman, or an empire. It was not holy in the sense of what we know holiness. It was not Roman because it was the Franks who was the power which was in charge, and it was not an empire because it had no imperial state like Rome had before. But this is the principle, what we've got in verse 11, that he beheld another beast coming up out of the earth. In contrast to the sea, because all the other events had to do around the Mediterranean, this beast was to come out of the earth, out of Europe. And he had two horns like a lamb, and he spake as a dragon. And the two horns are identified with the two powers which ruled the Holy Roman Empire. That on the one hand of the Emperor Charlemagne, and on the other hand the Pope. And the Holy Roman Empire always had those two dominant powers, as we would term them, the Church and the State. And therefore these two horns had dual control over the beast system which had been developed. The religious one, obviously, was supported by the political one. But nevertheless, because the political one was Christianized, i.e. a supporter of the papacy, then obviously he recognized and acknowledged the edicts which went forth from Rome. So it's the same as if today we have got a ruler of a particular country who is a Roman Catholic. Although he has got the political power, he will nevertheless obviously submit from a religious point of view to the Pope as being the head of the church, whereas the Pope, to extend his influence in a particular country, needs the help of the ruler of that particular country. And it was more apparent in these days when the Holy Roman Empire came into being, with this dual situation of the military power, the political power, with the armies of the Franks, and the religious power of the papacy. Now you'll notice, although it was like a lamb, it spake as a dragon. And the dragon we have seen from chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13 always had reference to the military power. And that's what it was. It was military, it was political, but it gave the appearance of the lamb. And the lamb obviously symbolizing the religious aspect. In other words, that everything was done in the name of Christ. And most of Europe became annexed under this dual control of the French and the papacy. And the cry obviously was that it was all done in the name of religion. Now I'm not going to bore you with all the details of the history, it's all there to be read, but you will probably recall that the Franks' power, after annexing back Italy and Rome, also then it extended its influence throughout Europe, and quickly Germany followed in the series of battles which it fought and won. And the power base after Charlemagne was to move from France to Germany, finally ending up in Austria. And that's why generally you will find that the Holy Roman Empire is spoken of as being Germanic in nature. But it wasn't. It was the Franks, first of all, who moved their power base from France to Germany and finally ending up in Austria. But we shall come to that a little later. Now, if you'll notice in verse 12, he exerciseth all the power of the first beast before him, and causeth the earth and them which dwell therein to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. The influence of Christianity was extended as the conquest of this Franco power gained in ascendancy. He exercised the power of the first beast and caused, as a result of his military conquest, all that dwell upon the earth to worship the power of the papacy. As we have got in verse 4, the dragon gave the power unto the beast. The East gave its support to the church. And so now Charlemagne and the Franco power gave its support to the papacy. And when it made its conquest, it caused all those who had been conquered to worship the beast. In other words, they had to convert to being, as we would term it today, a Roman Catholic. They had to conform to Christianity. Now, for those who like to link up the book of Daniel with the Apocalypse, can we take you back to Daniel chapter 7? Because Daniel chapter 7 and verse 8 is the very time period which we're now discussing. I considered the horns, and behold, another little horn, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things. And the 3 horns that were plucked up by the roots were the Vandals, the Lombards, and the Huns. And you will find in the conquest by Charlemagne, in order to restore the power of the papacy once again, in order for him to free Italy from the barbarian tribes, he had to overturn the power of the Lombards, who had taken over Italy, the power of the Huns, and the power of the Vandals, in order to re-establish the supremacy of the papacy in the earth and to establish the Holy Roman Empire. And therefore it's generally been considered that verse 8 of Daniel chapter 7 is speaking about the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, as the papacy obviously from that time forward never looked back until the year 1866 to 1870, when it lost its power. So coming back to chapter 13 of the Apocalypse, just out of, I suppose, interest, for those who are students of modern history, you remember Hitler wanted to dominate the world for a period, as he stated, of 1,000 years through the means of what he termed the Third Reich. And the power of Germany at the time of the Second World War under Hitler was dominated by the Third Reich. And if any of you have studied Hitler and his life and anything about the Second World War, you will realise why he termed his power the Third Reich. The First Reich was the Holy Roman Empire. The Second Reich was the Federation of Germany, the establishment of Germany as a power. And the third one was the one that he had established, which was going to dominate the world. And he was going to dominate the world, so he said, for 1,000 years. And just incidentally, that was almost the time in which the Holy Roman Empire, the First Reich, had dominated the world. But that is purely just in passing. Nothing to do, I can assure you, with the 13th chapter. Anyway, coming back to the 13th chapter, and at verse 13, and he doeth great wonders, so that he maketh fire to come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. Now again, we're not talking about literal, we're talking about political, the heavens, the ruling powers, the earth, those that are ruled. And the bringing down of fire, we have seen again before in the study of the Apocalypse, but let's take you back to Isaiah chapter 42 and see the way that the fire speaks of the warfare and the destruction which this power was going to bring upon the earth. Isaiah 42. Therefore he hath, verse 25, Isaiah 42, verse 25, therefore he hath poured upon him the fury of his anger and the strength of battle, and hath set him on fire round about. Yet he knew not, and he burned him, yet he laid it not to heart. And again, we can go through many references, but let's just go to the 13th chapter of Zechariah, where again the prophet uses the principle of fire in the aspect of warfare and of destruction. Zechariah 13, verse 9. Well, we'd better go to verse 8 for connection. It shall come to pass that in all the land, saith Yahweh, 2 parts therein shall be cut off and die, but the third shall be left therein, and I will bring the third part through the fire. And the fire is speaking of, obviously in the context, like Peter does, of the refiner's fire. But the means by which they are brought through is through the fire of destruction in the battle of Armageddon, as God brings his judgment upon his people at that time. The fire of affliction as they suffer at his hand. And therefore, coming back to the 13th verse of the 13th chapter, the bringing down of fire from the political, the ruling powers of that time upon the earth was to show the atrocities and the destruction which this power of the Franks would bring in the sight of men. For what reason? So that they might worship him, the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. That was the principle. Although there was political and personal ambition, it was also to extend the power of the papacy in the earth. And verse 14 tells us, and he deceiveth them that dwell upon the earth by means of those miracles which he had power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell upon the earth that they should make an image to the beast, which had the wound by a sword and did live. Now obviously he had not got the power of the miracles in the sense of what Jesus Christ had done or what the apostles had done. The word for miracles is in the Greek the same as signs and wonders. And the idea the idea of it was the military power that he had influenced in the sight of men, which caused them to surrender to that power and to submit to his authority when he gave forth the edict that they should worship the beast whose deadly wound was healed. And it's quite amazing as you go through the history how that the Franco power caused the oppressed to worship the beast. And you'll notice at the end of verse 14 that they were to make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. Now the word for image is the word for likeness. Now unless someone can come up with something, there is no actual historical setting which I've been able to find where actually they made an image in the form of an effigy to the beast. I believe the Revelator is using it in a symbolic way. And the reason I believe that is for what we've got in verse 15. He had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. I think what it's saying. He had power, this is the military might, he had power to back up and support what he was saying. He had the power to give life, margin, breath, unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as that would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. Now if we go back to the thought of an image which had been erected in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, that was an exact stature. And we know that the three friends of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, would not bow down to worship the image which had been established in the lands of Babylon. Now here, I do not believe the revelator is saying there was an exact image, but rather the idea has the word image has the idea of likeness. It's got the idea, according to Vine, of representation. And the beast had the representation of its power invested into it by the military power of the Franks. For what reason? That people who did not submit to its edicts could be put to death. It gave the power unto the beast that he could speak, in other words, give the papal proclamations and cause as many as would not worship that they should be killed. Now it's quite significant when we think and contemplate what the revelator is saying, that the great controversy which had raised between the Western Church and the Eastern Church was over the worship of idols. And the Eastern Church eventually broke away from Rome and established what we come to know today as the Greek Orthodox Church. The Greek Orthodox Church would not support the worship of idols. Rome did. And the Catholic Church, the power of the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, supported the worship of idols, as it does even to this day. And we have obviously the principle of the Madonna and other such effigies that it worships. But if we can just go on in thought to verse 16. And he causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads, and that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark, or the name of the beast, or the number of his name. So you notice the implication which the revelator is bringing before us. The military power, started by Charlemagne and continued by successive powers, gave their authority for the beast to be worshipped. And therefore all the representation of the beast, i.e. the image of the beast, was there for people to submit and pay homage to. And if they didn't, then the authority was given to the beast that they could be killed. And not only so, that no man could buy or sell without this mark being given unto them. So what it was giving was to the papacy complete authority and power to issue its decrees and declarations to cause men to submit to its power. And if it didn't, they were put to death. Now that links with the thought in chapter 11 which we started out with tonight. At the end of verse 2, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. And the papacy had the power not only to go against the two witnesses, the woman and the earth, but also to extend its influence over the true ecclesia of Christ as well. And the power which was given it was by the emperor, by the Franco power, which was the other horn of this beast of the earth. But you'll notice what it was doing. It had been started by Constantine back in AD 312. What the military power was doing right the way through, whether we look from Constantine, whether we look to the east at the time of the beast of the sea, or whether we look now to Charlemagne with the beast of the earth, what it was doing was elevating the authority and the power of the papacy. No man could do anything unless the Pope agreed, even to the point of restriction of trade, even to the point that if it did not submit itself to whatever representation the papacy wanted to place upon itself, if they didn't submit to that, they had got the authority to put people to death. It was total conversion or destruction. Now the importance of that is linked to the 17th and 18th chapter of the Apocalypse. And if we can come to the 18th chapter, just to remind us, and we'll look at it in detail when we get there. You'll notice in verse 23 of chapter 18, when Rome eventually will find its demise totally, the light of a candle shall shine no more at all in thee. The voice of the bridegroom and the bride shall be heard no more at all in thee. For thy merchants were the great men of the earth, for by thy sorceries were all nations deceived. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth. And that links us back to this power and authority which successive military powers had given unto the papacy, in order for them both to tread down the holy city in chapter 11 and also to extend its total influence upon the earth, so that in her was found the blood of all that would not submit to her rule. Now we've got to appreciate this for what it's going on to say in the Apocalypse, but let's just come back for a second to verse 14 and 15. You're right, George? Good. But come back to verse 14 and 15. That they should submit to this beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. And this power, this military power, gave life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast, the representation of the Catholic system, in whatever form it wanted to put itself forward to the people as, should be obeyed. Full stop. So whether it was on the principle of the Trinity, whether it was upon the principle of the infallibility of the Pope, whether it was in the principle of the worship of the Virgin Mary, whether it was the principle of idol worship, whether it was the principle of come what may, the papacy had the total right to represent itself in whatever form and way it wanted to. There was no restriction. There was no way anybody could oppose the declarations that went forth from Rome. That was the license which the papacy was given by Charlemagne and successive emperors. Quite incredible when you would think that this military power allowed the Roman Catholic Church to dictate to the people of the earth in such a way. But here is the mind that hath wisdom. It was God who was overseeing all the affairs of men. It was God who had prophesied through the Lord Jesus Christ in chapter 11 that this church, abhorrent as it was in his sight, would have the authority to extend its influence over the woman and the earth, the two witnesses, and the holy city for that long period of time, from the time when it received its power and authority right down to the 19th century. And the only way that he could sustain that power was for successive military governments to support it and to give its authority. And during this 1,000-year reign of the Holy Roman Empire, some of the atrocities which the Catholic Church committed make awful reading. It was given free range by this military power. And you'll notice the very language of verse 15. It was given power to speak. And nobody could challenge what it said. Otherwise, they were to be killed. And verse 16 says, He causeth all, small, great, rich, poor, free, bond, to receive a mark in their right hand and in their forehead, and no man might buy or sell, save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Now the word mark appears in the Apocalypse numerous times. Would you like to make a note? It appears here obviously in chapter 13, verses 16 and 17. It appears again in chapter 14 at verses 9 and verse 11. It appears in chapter 15 at verse 2, at chapter 16 and at verse 2, chapter 19 and verse 20, and chapter 20 and verse 4. That's Revelation 13 verses 16 and 17, chapter 14 verse 9 and 11, chapter 15 verse 2, chapter 16 verse 2, chapter 19 verse 20, chapter 20 and verse 4. The word mark appears. It's the only time that the word appears in the Apocalypse. And on each and every occasion it's linked to the mark of the beast. Let's just take a couple of those references. Just go to chapter 14 and have a look at verse 9. The third angel followed them with a loud voice, saying, If any man worship the beast and his image, and receiveth his mark in his forehead or in his hand. Again, we go forward to chapter 16 and verse 2. Speaking of the angels of the vials, the first went and poured out his vial upon the earth, and there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast. And each time the word mark appears in the book of the Apocalypse, it's always in connection with the mark of the beast. Never in other connection whatsoever. And just incidentally, the word only appears once more in the whole of the New Testament scriptures. And that's in the book of the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 17. Acts chapter 17, and we know the context of the verse well. Paul on Mars Hill, Acts chapter 17 and in verse 29, Forasmuch then as we are the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the Godhead is like unto gold or silver or stone, graven by art and man's device. And that word graven is the same Greek word as translated mark in the Apocalypse. And that's the only other time the word appears in the New Testament scriptures. And the word literally means to be graven. It was something which was graven, inscribed. And always it's used in the Apocalypse in connection with the beast. And the mark of the beast was upon their right hand and in their foreheads. And I don't think there's anybody in this room who doesn't know what the mark of the beast is. And to this very day, the mark is inscribed in the right hand and in the forehead of the adherents to those who worship the beast. When a child is christened, the mark of the beast is inscribed upon its forehead by the water being taken by the priest in the form of the cross, and there inscribed. When a priest is ordained to the church, in order for it to be able to after it's gone through all its teaching and in its doctrination, when it takes upon its what's the word? It's not parish, is the Church of England. What's the one in the Catholic? Diocese. When the priest takes over the church, the Roman Catholic Church, and it receives the authority from its hierarchy to be ordained in that way, the sign of the beast, the sign of the cross, is placed across the right hand of the priest. And to the very day, the ordination of the priest is ratified by the sign of the cross being inscribed by water over the right hand of the priest. And the sign of the cross has been the mark of the beast down the ages, even to this day and generation. And therefore you'll notice in verse 16 that no one could do anything save he that had received the mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. In other words, had submitted themselves to the power of the papacy. And the Revelator says in verse 18, here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and the number is 666. Just recapitulate for a second. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding. Can I take you back to Matthew's Gospel and chapter 24? Again, we've made reference to this in the past, but nevertheless, there's a point here which I feel is worth establishing again. You remember during the discourse of the Olivet prophecy, in verse 14 of Matthew 24, the Master says, the gospel of the kingdom was to be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When ye shall therefore see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. And we've connected the thought of the abomination of desolation back to the prophecy of Daniel, and to see how the very things which Daniel saw in prophecy reached their fulfillment in the Roman power in AD 70, when God used that power to destroy both his people and the temple itself. But you'll notice what the Master says. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding. And there's a connection with the thought of let him understand the abomination of desolation. With those who have got wisdom, let him understand the very power and nature of this beast. Why? Because I believe the Revelator is again taking our thought back to the prophecy of Daniel. Can I take you back to the 11th chapter of Daniel? Again, verses which we looked at only a few weeks ago. And we come to verse 37 of Daniel 11, where the prophet was giving us this overall picture of the development of the papal power. Verse 37 says, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honour the God of forces, the God of guardians, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honour with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory. And the idea of the phrase there, strongholds, is the word for bazaars. And that's why some translate verse 38, the God of forces, as the God of bazaars, or the God of guardians, because there is a connection in word between the strongholds of verse 39. But let's just dwell upon verse 39. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds. And the idea is the bazaars. And we all know what the Eastern bazaars were, the trading places. And the thought there is that this papacy, this system, which Daniel just gives us a brief overall sketch with, says he shall do in the bazaars, which he shall do with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase. So why would Daniel use the idea in connection with the Catholic Church of that of bazaars? Well, can I take you to that 18th chapter of the Apocalypse, which we looked at a little bit earlier. And you'll notice in the halfway through verse 23, speaking of this papal system, thy merchants were the great men of the earth. And the idea of a merchant is obviously somebody who trades. And the papal system was given the authority that no man could trade apart from they themselves giving the authority. No man might buy or sell save he that had the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his names. Therefore, the Catholic Church, the clergy, became the merchants of the earth. The churches became the bazaars, the trading places, as the papacy exercised all the power which would cause people to want to trade in anything whatsoever. Obviously, they trade in all sorts of things, including the souls of men. But it's significant how Daniel speaks that they would establish these, what he terms as bazaars, where the Apocalypse speaks of them as being the merchants of the earth, the traders, and that all trade was directed through the Catholic Church, because no man could do anything unless he had submitted himself to their power and authority, or had received the mark in their right hand and in their foreheads. And of course, again, thinking about it, the right hand is the means of the strength. The man will go out to do the work with the power of his hands, whereas the forehead obviously is the brain, the thinking. And so whether it's in work or in thought, the papacy was to be completely dominant. So we come to that last phrase in chapter... That last phrase in verse 18. Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. 666. And the understanding of it, says the Revelator, is that we count that number. And in the counting of that number, we'll identify it with the beast which has gone before. Now, without going into it, because it will take me obviously a few minutes to explain what is suggested by this, we'll leave it over to next time, God willing. And then we'll also contrast chapter 13 with chapter 14 with those who stand with the Lamb upon Mount Zion, having the Father's name written in their foreheads. Not the mark of the beast, but the name of the Father. And we also want to